In a time lost in the mists of memory, long before the legions marched along the roads of the world and emperors adorned their brows with laurel crowns, Rome was merely a whisper on the banks of the Tiber River. The origins of the city that would shape Western civilization are shrouded not in certain historical facts, but in myths, legends, and symbols that have endured through the centuries, fueling the imagination of peoples. Among all these narratives, one imposed itself with irresistible force, that of Romulus and Remus, the twins destined by the gods to found an eternal city. Tradition tells that Numitor, the legitimate king of Alba Longa, a city located south of where Rome would emerge, was overthrown by his own brother Amulius, eager for power. To ensure that no legitimate heir could claim the throne, Amulius forced Rhea Silvia, Numitor's daughter, to become a Vestal, a priestess consecrated to the cult of the goddess Vesta, and therefore condemned to a perpetual vow of chastity. But the usurper's plans were thwarted by a force beyond human control. Mars, the god of war, who is said to have united with Rhea Silvia, causing her to bear twin sons, Romulus and Remus. When the newborns came into the world, Amulius, seized by fury and fear, ordered that they be killed. However, fate, or perhaps the divine will itself, intervened. The twins were placed in a basket and cast into the waters of the Tiber, where the current carried them to a tranquil shore at the foot of the Palatine Hill. There, according to myth, a she-wolf found them and, in a gesture of compassionate ferocity, suckled them as if they were her own cubs. The image of the Capitoline wolf hunched over the two boys became one of the most powerful icons of Roman iconography, eternally sculpted in bronze and memory. Later, a shepherd named Faustulus and his wife Laurentia found the twins and raised them as their own sons, teaching them the simple and harsh arts of rural life. As adults, Romulus and Remus discovered their true lineage and avenged themselves against Amulius, restoring Numitor to the throne of Alba Longa. But the story did not end there. The brothers decided to found a new city, in the place where they had been saved by fate and by the she-wolf. On the hills of Latium, a disagreement then arose that would seal the future of the city and of men. Remus wanted to establish the city on the Aventine Hill, while Romulus preferred the Palatine. Unable to reach an agreement, they resorted to augury, signs from the gods observed in the flight of birds, an essential practice in Roman religion. Remus is said to have seen 6 vultures, while Romulus saw 12, interpreting the higher number as proof of his divine choice. The dispute, however, did not cease. On a fateful day, Remus, in an act of mockery, is said to have leaped over the walls newly traced by Romulus, challenging his power and the symbolic boundaries of the nascent city. In a fit of rage, or as some prefer to believe, in a ritual gesture, Romulus killed his brother, thus proclaiming a sentence that would mark the city from its very first moment. Rome would be founded upon blood, violence, and power. Thus, on April 21st, in the year 753 before Christ, a date fixed by Roman tradition, Romulus traced with a plough the sacred perimeter of the new city encircling the Palatine Hill. He established laws, organized an army, and realizing the need to populate the city, instituted the famous episode of the abduction of the Sabine women, consolidating alliances with neighboring peoples and ensuring Rome's survival. The story of Romulus and Remus not only provided an explanation for the city's origin, but also bequeathed to the Romans an exemplary narrative about the harshness of politics, the importance of divine will, and the supremacy of foundation over blood ties. The Capitoline wolf thus became not only a maternal symbol, but the living metaphor of a city that always fed on the tension between civilization and nature, between power and piety, between violence and foundation. Behind the myth, historians and archaeologists recognize the presence of a historical reality. Latin villages scattered across the hills of Latium that, in the 8th century before Christ, would have progressively united, consolidating into a community that in the following centuries would transform a village into a metropolis, a city into an empire, and an empire into a civilization. But for the Romans, this factual explanation would never replace the overwhelming power of the legend. Rome was born with the milk of a she-wolf and the blood of a brother, and that would be its destiny. After the mythical foundation traced with a plough in the fertile soil of the Palatine, Rome entered a new phase, the monarchical period, dominated by 7 kings whose biographies, often shrouded in legend, constitute a mosaic of tradition, religiosity, and power. These kings, more than fully verifiable historical figures, embodied virtues and vices that shaped the political and social institutions of the nascent city, imprinting on young Rome a character that would remain in its structures for centuries. The reign of the kings was not only the time of building walls and temples, but above all, of constructing the moral and legal foundations that would sustain the Grand Republic and later, the Empire. The first king, as it could not be otherwise, was Romulus, the founder. After the murder of his brother Remus, Romulus assumed the leadership of the new community, organizing the army, instituting laws, and promoting alliances. The most famous episode of his rule was the abduction of the Sabine women. To secure wives for his warriors and perpetuate the population, Romulus organized a religious festivity that attracted neighboring peoples, and amidst the celebrations, the Romans kidnapped the Sabine women. The subsequent conflict was appeased by the women themselves, who, already integrated into Roman families, interceded for peace between their fathers and husbands. The fusion between Romans and Sabines consolidated the city as an emerging political force in the region. After the mysterious death of Romulus, some say he was taken up to the heavens and deified as Quirinus, Rome chose its second king, Numa Pompilius, a Sabine known for his wisdom and piety. Numa established the religious foundations of Rome, organizing the main cults, such as that of Janus, and creating the College of Pontiffs, which would regulate religion and the calendar. Under his leadership, Rome experienced a period of peace and spiritualization, with the foundation of institutions that would guide civic and religious life for centuries. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, broke with Numa's peace and turned toward war and expansion. Celebrated for his combat against Alba Longa, his own city of origin, Tullus was responsible for the destruction of his mother metropolis and for the incorporation of its inhabitants into the Roman population. This policy of integration profoundly marked the Roman ethos. Instead of destroying conquered peoples, Rome often assimilated them, expanding its demographic and cultural strength. Ancus Marcius, the fourth king, continued this dual model of war and colonization. He founded the port city of Ostia, ensuring Rome's strategic access to the sea and trade. During his reign, Rome expanded its borders and consolidated its power over neighboring Latins, projecting itself as a hegemonic center in the Latium region. From the fifth king onward, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the Roman monarchy increasingly assumed an Etruscan character. Tarquinius, originally from Tarquinia, a powerful Etruscan city, is said to have migrated to Rome with the aim of social ascension. His election demonstrates the city's openness to foreigners endowed with talent and ambition, a trait that would be decisive for its later expansion. Tarquinius propelled major public works, such as the Cloaca Maxima, a monumental drainage system that allowed the urbanization of the Roman Forum, and began the construction of the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, consolidating the Capitoline Hill as a religious and political center. His successor, Servius Tullius, possibly also of Etruscan origin, stood out for implementing Rome's first structural social reforms. He created the census-based class system, organizing citizens according to their wealth and establishing the structure of the centuries, which combined military and political functions. This reform was crucial for the later organization of the Republic and furthermore strengthened the army, enabling new military campaigns. The construction of the Servian Wall is also attributed to him, an ambitious fortification project that delimited and protected the city against external threats. Finally, the monarchical cycle culminated with the reign of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. His government was marked by authoritarianism, contempt for the nascent republican traditions, and violence against his opponents. The most infamous episode of his reign involves his son, Sextus Tarquinius, who raped Lucretia, a noble Roman woman, provoking her tragic death, and consequently, the popular uprising led by Lucius Junius Brutus. The revolt culminated in Tarquinius's expulsion and the definitive abolition of the monarchy, giving way to a new political model, the Roman Republic. The narrative of the Roman kings represents more than a sequence of sovereigns. It is the elaboration of a political and moral pedagogy that the Romans transmitted as an integral part of their identity. Each king illustrates an aspect of the city's formation: foundation, religiosity, war, colonization, engineering, And finally, the risk of absolute power and the necessity of freedom. With the end of the monarchy, Rome not only bid farewell to its kings, but incorporated into its civic memory the eternal vigilance against tyranny, making freedom one of the pillars of its future greatness. The end of the reign of Tarquinius Superbus was not merely the deposition of a monarch, but the birth of a new political ideal, the Roman Republic, shaped by resistance to tyranny, the exaltation of liberty, and the unwavering belief in the supremacy of institutions over individuals. From this decisive moment onward, Rome would define itself not by the will of a king, but by the complex architecture of magistracies, councils, and laws that would consecrate virtus and libertas as fundamental values. This was a turning point that not only changed the city's political structure, but defined a legacy that would resonate for centuries, inspiring peoples far beyond the Tiber. The narrative of the Republican foundation is deeply linked to the personal drama of Lucretia, a Roman woman whose virtue was outraged by Prince Sextus Tarquinius. Unable to endure the affront, Lucretia took her own life after demanding that her family and friends avenge her honor. This act catalyzed a revolt led by figures such as Lucius Junius Brutus and Publius Valerius Publicola, who summoned the people and deposed Tarquinius, abruptly ending the monarchical regime. From this insurrection, the young republic instituted a radically different system. No man would ever again hold lifetime power, and leadership would be shared between two magistrates, the consuls, elected annually. The consulship, the supreme symbol of the new order, was designed to prevent the concentration of power. Each consul held the same authority, and the mutual right of veto ensured that no decision could be made unilaterally. Alongside this new magistracy, the Senate was consolidated, a consultative body composed mainly of patricians, heirs of the ancient aristocratic families whose influence would remain decisive in guiding the Roman state. The Republic, however, was not a full democracy, but an oligarchic system that favored the traditional elite, although over time it was forced to open institutional spaces to the demands of the plebeians. The first century of the Republic was marked by a series of social conflicts known as the struggle between patricians and plebeians. The plebeians, numerically predominant and economically essential, were excluded from the main political and religious offices, often falling victim to abuses by the patricians. To resist this oppression, the plebeians developed the secessio plebis, a form of political strike in which they collectively withdrew from the city, paralyzing public life and forcing concessions. The first of these secessions resulted in the creation of the tribune of the plebs, a revolutionary magistracy whose holders, the tribunes, were sacrosanct, that is, inviolable, and held the power of intercession and veto in defense of plebeian interests. Parallel to these social achievements, the Republic initiated a process of legal codification, essential to limit abuses and establish objective criteria for justice. Thus arose the famous Laws of the 12 Tables, compiled in the mid-5th century before Christ, considered the foundation of Roman law. Engraved in bronze and displayed in the Forum, these laws ensured a relative legal security and formal equality, even though social inequalities persisted in practice. The young Republic also faced external and internal threats that tested its capacity for survival. Among these, the most notable was the attempt to restore the monarchy by Tarquinius Superbus, who sought support from Etruscan cities to reclaim the throne. The Roman victory at the Battle of Lake Regillus consolidated the definitive expulsion of the Tarquins and strengthened the Romans' confidence in their new political system. At the same time, Rome waged incessant wars with neighboring peoples of Latium, such as the Volsci, the Aequi, and the Sabines, in a continuous territorial expansion that tested its institutions and forged its military character. The Republican structure proved highly efficient in this context, as it allowed the rapid mobilization of citizen soldiers and the collegial command of military campaigns by the consuls. Culturally, the Republic consolidated values that would be repeated as mantras by the Roman political elite. Virtus, understood as courage, discipline, and excellence. Fides, that is, mutual loyalty and trust. And above all, libertas, the political freedom that contrasted Roman citizens with the subjects of Eastern monarchies, considered submissive to the whims of despots. This period also witnessed the affirmation of an austere and frugal lifestyle, valued as an antidote to corruption and luxury, seen as mortal enemies of republican freedom. The paradigmatic figures of this ethos are Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, the farmer who left his plough to temporarily assume the dictatorship, and having saved the republic, immediately relinquished power, and Gnaeus Marcius Coriolanus, whose trajectory illustrates the complexities of political and familial loyalties. Thus, the foundation of the Roman Republic was not a sudden and isolated act, but the beginning of a long and dynamic process in which resilient institutions and a political culture marked by the tension between tradition and innovation, authority and participation, elite and people were forged. By freeing itself from its kings, Rome not only created a new system of government, but also a republican mentality that even today inspires societies striving to balance power and freedom. With republican institutions firmly established and the Roman civic spirit galvanized by the defense of liberty against tyranny, Rome turned its gaze beyond the borders of Latium, initiating a long and relentless process of expansion that, in the end, would secure near total control of the entire Italian peninsula. This movement, which extended over more than 2 centuries, was not the result of a premeditated plan of domination, but rather the outcome of a complex web of alliances, rivalries, defensive and offensive conflicts, where militarism and politics became inseparably intertwined. Soon after the foundation of the Republic, Rome found itself surrounded by warlike peoples competing for the same vital space: the Sabines to the northeast, the Equi and Volsci to the southeast, the Latins and Hernici to the south, and the powerful Etruscans to the north. Initially, the struggle focused on defense against incursions and raids, but it quickly evolved into expansionist campaigns driven by the desire for security and prestige. Each victory, each conquered city, opened new frontiers and created new threats, requiring more wars, more victories, and more territory. This inexorable cycle transformed Rome from a vulnerable city-state into the hegemonic power of the peninsula. The wars against the Volsci and Equi were especially harsh and protracted. These mountain peoples, brave and tenacious, imposed severe difficulties on the Roman armies, which had to refine their siege tactics and combat skills in rugged terrain. In response, Rome developed an extraordinary capacity for military and logistical adaptation, building roads and fortifications that ensured not only the movement of troops, but also the effective control of conquered regions. Another decisive milestone was the Latin War, fought between 340 and 338 before Christ. Until then, Rome was part of the Latin League, a confederation of Latian peoples united for mutual defense. However, as Roman power grew, irreconcilable tensions emerged, culminating in open conflict. Rome's victory led to the dissolution of the League and the direct incorporation of several Latin cities, which, although subdued, were skillfully integrated into the Roman political structure through the selective granting of citizenship, either full or partial. This model of expansion, based more on assimilation than annihilation, was one of the keys to Rome's success. Subsequently, Rome turned to the Apennine Mountains, facing the Samnites in 3 prolonged and bloody wars. The Samnites, a warrior and proud people, proved worthy adversaries, inflicting humiliating defeats on the Romans, such as at the Battle of the Caudine Forks in 321 before Christ, when the Roman army was forced to pass under the Samnite yoke, an arch of spears symbolizing surrender and dishonor. However, far from destroying Roman morale, this defeat fueled an even fiercer determination. Rome reorganized its army, perfected the manipular formation, a tactical formation that replaced the traditional phalanx and provided greater flexibility in uneven terrain, and, after decades of combat, finally defeated the Samnites, consolidating its dominance over central Italy. Victory over the Samnites put Rome on a collision course with the powerful cities of Magna Graecia in the southern peninsula, where Greek communities had flourished for centuries, radiating culture, commerce, and sophistication. The city of Tarentum, the most influential of them, fearful of Roman expansion, sought the aid of Pyrrhus, king of Epirus and relative of Alexander the Great. Thus began the so-called Pyrrhic War, marked by epic battles and the famous episode of Pyrrhic victories, victories won at such a high cost that, in practice, they resembled defeats. Pyrrhus, one of the greatest military strategists of his time, brought with him a well-trained army and war elephants, exotic weapons that initially caused panic in the Roman ranks. However, Roman resilience proved superior. After several indecisive battles and the gradual loss of local support, Pyrrhus returned to Epirus, leaving Tarentum to its fate. The city was conquered in 272 before Christ, marking the effective end of Greek independence in Italy and the absolute triumph of Rome over the peninsula. This long series of conflicts not only expanded Roman territory unprecedentedly, but also forged its identity as a military and political power. The experience accumulated in the Italian wars was fundamental to the formation of a disciplined, experienced, and professional army, capable of operating on multiple fronts simultaneously and imposing its will on culturally diverse peoples. At the same time, the system of alliances and partial citizenship implemented by Rome created a network of dependency and loyalty that ensured internal stability and facilitated the mobilization of human and material resources for future campaigns. The construction of strategic roads, such as the Via Appia, connecting Rome to Capua and later to Brundisium, consolidated not only military domination, but also the economic and administrative integration of the new possessions. Finally, the conquest of Italy launched Rome onto the international stage, establishing the conditions for future confrontations with external powers, especially Carthage, with whom it would rival for control of the Mediterranean. Thus, by completing the unification of the peninsula, Rome not only ensured its survival, but also prepared itself, consciously or not, for the next chapter of its history: imperial expansion overseas, transforming from a city into an empire, from a regional power into master of the world. With the Italian peninsula pacified under its control, Rome emerged as the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean. But its path to global empire would encounter a formidable obstacle: Carthage, the Phoenician city-state located in North Africa, whose mercantile wealth, naval power, and trade networks extended throughout the African, Iberian, and insular coasts. The confrontation between these two superpowers, Rome and Carthage, not only shaped the course of the ancient world, but forged, through 3 devastating Punic Wars, the definitive identity of Rome as an empire and an irresistible military force. The First Punic War, 264–241 before Christ, was the first major naval conflict in Roman history. Until then, Rome had been a land power with little maritime tradition, while Carthage possessed the largest fleet in the Mediterranean. The initial dispute centered on Sicily, a strategic and wealthy island situated between the two powers. The confrontation began as a Roman intervention in the city of Messina, but quickly escalated into a total war. Demonstrating an impressive capacity for adaptation, the Romans copied Carthaginian ship models and created the corvus, an ingenious mobile boarding bridge with hooks that allowed the legions to board enemy ships and turn naval combat into land battles, a terrain in which the Romans were invincible. After decades of intense fighting, in which both sides suffered enormous losses, Rome emerged victorious, conquering Sicily, its first overseas province, and imposing heavy indemnities on Carthage. The victory transformed Rome into a naval power, opened new horizons for expansion, and intensified the rivalry with Carthage, which, humiliated, sought compensation by expanding into Hispania. But it was the Second Punic War, 218–201 before Christ, that would become one of the most extraordinary and legendary military campaigns of antiquity, eternally associated with the name of Hannibal Barca, the brilliant Carthaginian general. Hannibal, motivated by a thirst for revenge against Rome and the ambition to restore Carthaginian glory, led a daring and unexpected campaign. He marched from Hispania to Italy, crossing the Pyrenees, the Rhone, and finally the Alps, a feat considered impossible by many. His heroic crossing, accompanied by a heterogeneous army and war elephants, became a symbol of military genius and resistance against an apparently unbeatable enemy. On Italian soil, Hannibal inflicted successive devastating defeats on the Romans, who until then had never faced such a talented and unpredictable enemy. At the Battle of the Trebia, 218 before Christ, he surprised and destroyed a consular army. At Lake Trasimene, 217 before Christ, he executed a perfect ambush, annihilating more than 15,000 Roman soldiers. But it was at Cannae in 216 before Christ that Hannibal accomplished his masterpiece. With about 50,000 men, he defeated a Roman army that outnumbered him, using a double envelopment maneuver that would become a classic in military manuals. The massacre was so complete that it profoundly shook Roman morale and led several Italian cities to rebel. However, even in the face of these spectacular victories, Hannibal failed to break the central alliance between Rome and its most loyal Italian cities, nor did he receive significant reinforcements from Carthage. Rome, in turn, demonstrated its greatest virtue, the ability to resist, rebuild, and persevere. Under the leadership of Consul Quintus Fabius Maximus, nicknamed Cunctator, the Delayer, Rome adopted a strategy of attrition, avoiding pitched battles and slowly wearing down Hannibal's army. The definitive turning point came with the rise of Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus. Instead of continuing the direct confrontation in Italy, Scipio took the war to Hispania itself, expelling the Carthaginians and ultimately landing in North Africa. Hannibal was then called back to defend his native city. In 202 before Christ, at the Battle of Zama, Scipio defeated Hannibal, ending the war with a Roman victory and imposing severe conditions on Carthage. It lost its fleet, its possessions in Hispania, and was forced to pay a heavy indemnity. Despite the defeat, Carthage revived as a commercial power, but Rome never forgot the danger it had once faced. The residual tension and the hatred cultivated by the most bellicose sectors of the Senate, such as Cato the Elder, famous for ending all his speeches with the phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, culminated in the Third Punic War, 149–146 before Christ. Unlike the previous wars, the Third Punic War was an implacable siege of the city of Carthage. After 3 years of desperate resistance, the city was finally captured, sacked, and destroyed down to its foundations. According to ancient sources, the Romans even spread salt over the ruins so that nothing would grow there again, although this symbolic image is now considered more literary than factual. The Carthaginian territory was transformed into the Roman province of Africa, and Rome emerged as the absolute master of the Western Mediterranean. The Punic Wars were not merely military confrontations, but milestones of geopolitical, social, and economic transformation for Rome. Victory over Carthage consolidated Rome's imperial vocation, expanded its overseas domains, brought immense wealth and a massive influx of slaves, but also deepened social inequalities and eroded the traditional values that had sustained the Republic. By defeating the most formidable enemy it had ever faced, Rome sealed its destiny as an empire, but also opened the door to internal crises, social tensions, and new wars that, in the coming decades, would transform the Republic's political landscape and inexorably lead it toward further conflicts and its own metamorphosis into an empire. With the definitive destruction of Carthage and victory over the Hellenistic kingdoms in the east, Rome achieved unprecedented glory, consolidating itself as the hegemonic power of the Mediterranean. From the 2nd century before Christ onward, Roman armies no longer encountered natural limits. Their legions marched across the plains of Hispania, conquered Macedonia, subdued Greece, and advanced into Asia Minor. The known world was transformed into a vast mare nostrum, our sea, politically, economically, and militarily dominated by Rome. But this same expansion that enriched the Republic and enhanced its prestige simultaneously planted the seeds of its internal crisis. The massive influx of wealth from the wars of conquest triggered a profound social transformation. Ancient patrician families became even more powerful, while a new elite, the homines novi, enriched through trade and provincial administrations, emerged to vie for influence. The extensive lands conquered were converted into latifundia, worked by slave labor, replacing the small peasant farms that had until then constituted the backbone of Roman society. This process provoked the exodus of thousands of small rural proprietors who, dispossessed of their lands, migrated to Rome in search of sustenance, forming an urban mass of impoverished citizens known as proletari, whose only wealth was their offspring. The contrast between the opulence of the aristocrats and the misery of the urban masses became a defining characteristic of Roman society, fueling social and political tensions that would corrode the foundations of the republican system. Politically, Imperial expansion favored the emergence of new careers and the enlargement of personal power among generals. Military glory, once an expression of republican virtues, became an instrument of individual ambition. Victorious generals, such as Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who destroyed Macedonia, and Scipio Aemilianus, who razed Carthage, returned to Rome covered in prestige and wealth, with legions loyal more to their commanders than to the Senate. This imbalance undermined the authority of republican institutions, especially the Senate, which, although still the center of power, found itself increasingly pressured by forces beyond its control. In this context of transformation, the first great attempts at social reform arose, led by the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Tiberius, elected tribune of the plebs in 133 before Christ, proposed the Lex Sempronia Agraria, which aimed to redistribute public lands, many of them illegally appropriated by the aristocracy, to impoverished citizens. His proposal directly challenged the power of the senators, who reacted with violence. Tiberius was assassinated by a mob of senators and supporters, an episode that marked the beginning of political assassination as an instrument of dispute in Rome. A few years later, Gaius Gracchus resumed his brother's reformist ideal, expanding it to include measures such as the distribution of grain at subsidized prices and the extension of political rights to Italian allies. His government also faced fierce resistance from the Senate, culminating in his violent death and the execution of thousands of his supporters. The failure of the Gracchi reforms definitively exposed the inability of republican institutions to adapt peacefully to new social and economic realities. Meanwhile, military pressures continued. Rome faced internal revolts, such as the slave war led by Spartacus, and new expansionist campaigns, such as the wars against Mithridates, king of Pontus, who contested Roman supremacy in the east. The legions, increasingly professionalized and tied to the interests of their generals, became instruments of personal power, further amplifying the fragility of republican institutions. The situation worsened with the confrontation between Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, two prestigious generals who staged one of Rome's first civil wars. Marius, a supporter of popular reforms and promoter of profound changes in the army, such as the admission of proletarians into the legions, collided with Sulla, a conservative and defender of senatorial privileges. Sulla's victory and his subsequent dictatorship represented the culmination of the collapse of republican norms. For the first time, a Roman marched with his army upon the city itself, a precedent that would become recurrent in the following decades. Sulla, after eliminating his political enemies and conducting the infamous proscriptions, public lists of citizens condemned to death and the confiscation of their property, sought to restore the authority of the Senate and limit the powers of the tribunes of the plebs. But his authoritarian reforms, although momentarily effective, failed to halt the spiral of violence and instability. The collapse of republican traditions was already underway and seemed irreversible. Meanwhile, Rome continued to expand. It annexed Cisalpine Gaul, advanced into the east, transformed Greece into a province, and consolidated its dominion over North Africa. But paradoxically, the more Rome grew, the more its republic weakened. The vast territorial extent made administration difficult. Military commanders became increasingly powerful, and provincial populations, often exploited and excluded from civic rights, fostered resentments that corroded the legitimacy of the central government. The first century before Christ was therefore the stage of an ambiguous Rome, at once triumphant and torn, glorious and corroded from within. Traditional virtues, frugality, discipline, devotion to the homeland, gave way to an ethos marked by unbridled ambition, easy enrichment, and political violence. Imperial expansion not only took Rome to the ends of the earth, but also plunged it into a systemic crisis that would make the transition to a new regime inevitable. The Empire, the first century before Christ, marked the beginning of the terminal phase of the Roman Republic, a period dominated by civil wars, meteoric military ascents, and political violence that would become the norm rather than the exception. Among the protagonists of this cycle of rupture and transformation, two names stand out, synthesizing the forces in conflict: Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. The rivalry between these two generals and statesmen was not merely a personal dispute. but the dramatic expression of a political system that could no longer contain individual ambitions, nor manage the profound social and military changes generated by Roman expansionism. Gaius Marius, from a plebeian family of the city of Arpinum, represented the rise of the homines novi, new men who, without aristocratic origin, climbed to the highest political posts thanks to military talent and political skill. His trajectory was marked by extraordinary feats. Elected consul a record 7 times, Marius became the symbol of power acquired through military career. However, his greatest contribution to Roman history was not just victory in wars, but the radical transformation of the Roman army. Until then, the Republican army was based on the citizen-soldier model. Only landowners had the right and the duty to serve in the legions. With the impoverishment of the peasantry and the growing demand for soldiers, Marius promoted the so-called Marian reform, which allowed the recruitment of citizens without property, known as capite censi, in exchange for pay, equipment, and the promise of land at the end of service. This reform professionalized the army and turned it into a permanent institution, but at the same time created a direct dependence of soldiers on their generals, who now commanded more loyalty than the state that sent them into combat. With the army reformed and strengthened, Marius led brilliant campaigns. He defeated Jugurtha, the astute king of Numidia in North Africa. He overcame the invasions of the Cimbri and Teutons, Germanic peoples who threatened Italy, and consolidated his position as the most powerful general of his time. But power attracted enemies, and his figure became polarizing, especially among the aristocratic sectors of the Senate, who feared his popularity and reformist tendencies. In this context emerges Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a traditional patrician but also a skilled, ambitious and ruthless military leader. Sulla gained fame by capturing Jugurtha through a shrewd political and military alliance, rivaling Marius for the glory of that feat. Later, he led successful campaigns against Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, who had challenged Roman supremacy in the east. But it was his appointment to command the war against Mithridates that precipitated the direct confrontation between Marius and Sulla. The popular tribunate, under Marius's influence, annulled the Senate's decision, granting Sulla command of the war, transferring it to Marius. Sulla's reaction was unprecedented and brutal. Instead of accepting the civil decision, he marched with his legions on Rome for the first time in the Republic's history. This act deeply shocked Roman society, breaking the sacred taboo that separated military power from internal politics and inaugurating an era of military coups and civil wars. Sulla expelled Marius and his supporters, but while he conducted the campaign in the east, Marius's allies retook power in Rome, resulting in a period of terror and political vendettas. When Sulla returned victorious against Mithridates, he carried out a second march on Rome, promoting an even bloodier repression against his enemies. The height of his tyranny was the institution of the proscriptions, public lists of citizens condemned to death, whose properties were confiscated and whose families were socially marginalized. The proscriptions decimated political opponents, established a generalized climate of fear, and enriched Sulla's allies. Systematized terror became, from then on, a recurrent political tool in Rome. Sulla, assuming the title of dictator, implemented a vast program of constitutional reforms, with the declared objective of restoring the authority of the Senate and curbing the excesses of the popular tribunes. He severely limited the power of the tribunes of the plebs, reinforced senatorial control over magistracies, and attempted to reverse the democratizing trends that threatened the traditional oligarchy. However, his reforms, though impactful, could no longer contain the unleashed forces. After 2 years as dictator, Sulla surprised Rome by voluntarily abdicating power and retiring to private life, dying shortly after at his villa in Campania. But his resignation did not erase the effects of his rule. The precedent of direct military intervention in Roman politics was solidified, the practice of proscriptions institutionalized, and the fragility of republican institutions laid bare. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla, and the civil wars that arose from it, were more than episodes of violence. They represented the definitive failure of the political system that, for centuries, had sustained the Republic. Rome emerged from this conflict profoundly transformed. The legions were no longer instruments of the city, but of their generals. The Senate, though still formally powerful, was unable to arbitrate political disputes, and the plebs, increasingly impoverished, became a mass manipulated by populist and ambitious leaders. The path was now open for new figures, direct or indirect heirs of the strategies of Marius and Sulla, to emerge and lead Rome to its next and inevitable transformation: the rise of Julius Caesar, the definitive fall of the Republic, and the birth of the Empire. As the Roman Republic staggered under the weight of civil wars, institutional collapse, and the transformation of the army into a personal instrument of power, one figure emerged with irresistible brilliance: Caius Julius Caesar, or simply Julius Caesar. His dazzling trajectory was not only the culmination of a centuries-old historical process, but also the catalyst for a radical change: the end of the Republic and the birth of a new imperial era. A descendant of an ancient but impoverished patrician family, Caesar uniquely combined the prestige of a traditional name with the audacity of one who deeply understood the social and political changes corroding Rome. A brilliant orator, skilled lawyer, and unmatched military commander, he knew how to cultivate an irresistible public image and mobilize allies among the marginalized sectors of the plebs, as well as among powerful figures on the Roman political scene. His rise was propelled by the formation of the so-called First Triumvirate, an informal and secret alliance with two of the most powerful men of his time: Pompey the Great, a victorious general and icon of the senatorial aristocracy, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, known both for his colossal fortune and for his victory against the revolt of Spartacus. This pact of convenience enabled Caesar to be elected consul in 59 before Christ, and soon after, to obtain the command of Gaul, a province that would become the stage for his definitive consecration. For nearly a decade, between 58 and 50 before Christ, Caesar undertook one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in ancient history: the conquest of Gaul. Facing fierce peoples such as the Helvetii, Belgae, and especially the Gauls led by Vercingetorix, Caesar demonstrated tactical genius, relentless discipline, and a unique ability to transform military victories into political capital. The culmination of this campaign was the siege and surrender of Vercingetorix at Alesia, a feat that consolidated Roman domination over Gaul and provided Caesar with a legion of devoted soldiers and experienced veterans. But Caesar's glory aroused the fear of the Senate, and above all of Pompey, who after Crassus's death in a campaign against the Parthians, drew closer to the senatorial faction to contain the advance of his former ally. The confrontation became inevitable. Summoned to relinquish his military command and return to Rome as a mere citizen, Caesar opted for rupture. In 49 before Christ, he crossed the Rubicon, a small river that separated Cisalpine Gaul from Italy, reportedly uttering the famous phrase, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. Caesar's act was a declaration of war against the Republic itself. He quickly marched on Rome, which was abandoned by senatorial forces. Pompey and his allies took refuge in Greece, where they gathered a large army. The conflict culminated at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 before Christ, where, despite being outnumbered, Caesar decisively defeated Pompey. Pompey fled to Egypt seeking asylum, but was assassinated by order of the young pharaoh Ptolemy the Thegned, in a clumsy attempt to please Caesar. In Egypt, Caesar became involved with Cleopatra VII, Ptolemy's sister and the legitimate heir to the throne. Militarily supported by Caesar, Cleopatra consolidated her power, and from this alliance a son was born, Caesarion. The episode reinforced the fascination Caesar exerted, not only as a military man, but also as a political figure of international scope, shaping alliances and redefining the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. After consolidating his position in the East and crushing the last resistances in North Africa and Hispania, Caesar returned to Rome in absolute triumph. He accumulated multiple titles and honors: perpetual dictator, Pontifex Maximus Imperator. He implemented broad reforms, reorganized the calendar with the introduction of the Julian calendar, expanded the Senate by including representatives from the provinces, distributed land to veterans, and created new magistrate colleges. But the unprecedented concentration of power and the rupture with republican traditions aroused fear and resentment among the more conservative sectors of the senatorial aristocracy. To them, Caesar represented not merely a man, but the specter of a new form of government: monarchy. which Romans had abhorred since the expulsion of the Etruscan kings centuries earlier. Thus, on March 15, 44 before Christ, the famous Ides of March, Caesar was stabbed to death in the Senate by a group of conspirators led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, both former allies and beneficiaries of his clemency. The crime, perpetrated in the name of Libertas, had, however, the opposite effect of that desired. Instead of restoring the Republic, it plunged Rome into yet another civil war. Caesar's death could not stop the historical process he had set in motion. His legacy was overwhelming. He had transformed the army into a personal instrument, remodeled institutions to fit a new imperial reality, and created a model of charismatic leadership that transcended the old republican norms. Amid the chaos that followed his death, new figures would emerge. Mark Antony, his loyal general and political arm; Octavian, his grandnephew and adopted son, who, at only 18 years old, inherited his name and, with it, his ambitions; and Lepidus, another of his former allies. The alliance of these three men, the second triumvirate, would be the bloody epilogue of the Republic and the prelude to a new order, the Principate, under the leadership of Octavian, who would become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Thus, Caesar's triumph was not just the triumph of a man, but the triumph of an idea, that Rome could no longer be governed by an aristocratic republic, but required unified leadership capable of administering a vast, diverse, and ever-expanding empire. The century of crises found with Caesar its apex and conclusion. The Roman world would never be the same again. After decades of civil wars, massacres, proscriptions, and instability, Rome seemed destined for self-destruction. But from the ruins of the Republic and the blood spilled on battlefields emerged a figure who would definitively transform Rome's destiny, Gaius Octavius Thurinus, known for eternity as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Adoptive heir of Julius Caesar and absolute master of political art, Augustus not only refounded Rome under a new power structure, but also inaugurated an era of stability and prosperity that would be inscribed in history as the Pax Romana, a period of more than 2 centuries of relative peace and development. Augustus's trajectory began in his youth, when, at 18 years old, he learned of the assassination of his adoptive father, Caesar. Although inexperienced and underestimated by many of Rome's political veterans, Octavian quickly proved himself to be a ruthless and shrewd strategist. After securing the support of Caesar's legions and winning powerful allies, he formed, along with Mark Antony and Lepidus, the Second Triumvirate, an alliance with full powers to restore the Republic. In practice, however, this alliance resulted in a series of new proscriptions, political persecutions, and wars that culminated in the defeat of Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, at the Battle of Philippi in 42 before Christ. The victory consolidated the power of the triumvirate, but the ambitions of its members soon put them on a collision course. Lepidus was progressively marginalized and ultimately excluded from politics. Only Octavian and Mark Antony remained. The latter, after establishing himself in the East and allying, and both politically and romantically, with Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, came to be seen in Rome as a foreign threat to Roman sovereignty. Octavian skillfully exploited this perception, promoting an ideological campaign presenting himself as the defender of Roman values against the Oriental decadence embodied by Antony and Cleopatra. The conflict became inevitable. In 31 before Christ, Octavian's forces, alongside his trusted general Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, faced the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra at the famous Battle of Actium off the Greek coast. Octavian's victory was decisive. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where, surrounded and with no alternatives, they committed suicide. With this victory, Octavian became the absolute master of Rome and its vast empire. In 27 before Christ, in a gesture of rare political intelligence, Octavian announced to the Senate his renunciation of extraordinary powers and the restoration of the Republic. In return, the Senate granted him the honorary title of Augustus, meaning the consecrated one, the venerable, associating his name with the realm of sacredness and moral auctoritas. From then on, Octavian ceased to be simply a politician or general, transforming into the living embodiment of the Roman state, the princeps, the first citizen. Augustus managed to maintain republican forms while, in practice, concentrating in his hands all the essential instruments of power: supreme command of the legions, imperium proconsulare, religious authority as Pontifex Maximus, control of public finances, and the prerogative to directly influence elections and appointments to the most important offices. This structure, outwardly republican but effectively monarchical, became known as the Principate, a model that would endure for centuries. Augustus's work was not limited to politics. He profoundly reformed the army, creating a permanent and professional corps of legionaries, as well as the Praetorian Guard, destined for the princeps' personal protection and the security of the capital. He reorganized the provinces, distinguishing between those under his direct command and those administered by the Senate, ensuring more efficient and less corruption-prone governance. In the social and moral realm, Augustus sought to restore ancient Roman values, which he believed had been corrupted by civil wars and excessive luxury imported from the East. He promoted a series of laws encouraging marriage and birth rates, penalizing adultery, and exalting traditional morality. This policy aligned with a broad ideological campaign of renewal, whose ultimate symbol was the monumental urban transformation of Rome. Augustus undertook an ambitious construction program that renewed the city's appearance. He built temples such as that of Mars Ultor, celebrating his victory over Caesar's assassins, theaters and forums expanding civic space, and monuments such as the Ara Pacis Augustae, or Altar of Augustan Peace, a symbol of the harmony and prosperity brought by his rule. As he himself boasted, "I found a city of bricks and left it of marble." On the cultural front, Augustus's reign coincided with an unprecedented flourishing of the arts and letters. Under the patronage of figures such as Gaius Maecenas, a generation of poets emerged that would forever shape Western culture. Virgil, with his Aeneid, providing Rome with its national epic, linking its origin to Troy. Horace, with his odes celebrating moderation and order. And Ovid, whose sensual poetry ultimately clashed with Augustus's moralizing policy, leading to his exile. Augustus's foreign policy was marked by prudence and consolidation rather than aggressive expansion. Although he conducted important campaigns, such as the annexation of Egypt and the pacification of Hispania, his main concern was ensuring stable and defensible borders, especially along the Rhine and Danube. The tragic defeat of the legions commanded by Varus in the Teutoburg forest in 9 after Christ, when 3 Roman legions were annihilated by Germanic tribes, marked the limits of imperial expansion and reinforced Augustus's preference for border security. Upon his death in 14 after Christ, after more than 4 decades of rule, Augustus left Rome not only pacified and prosperous, but also irreversibly transformed. His legacy was immense: a territorially consolidated empire, an efficient administration, a flourishing culture, and a power model that, though cloaked in the trappings of the Republic, was in fact a monarchy under another name. The Senate, in recognition of his work, posthumously deified him, making him Divus Augustus the divine Augustus, thus integrating him into the Roman pantheon. And Rome, under his successors, would continue along the path he had opened: global empire, bureaucratic administration, stability guaranteed by legions, and monumental glory, still inscribed in the eternal stones of the city he refounded. With the death of Augustus in 14 after Christ, Rome not only lost its first prince, but also faced for the first time the delicate question of imperial succession. The political system created by Augustus, the Principate, lacked clear rules for the transfer of power, relying more on adoption, prestige, and consensus than on formal hereditary legitimacy. Nevertheless, power passed to Tiberius, the son of Augustus's wife, Livia Drusilla, and a member of the traditional Claudian family. Thus began the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which would rule Rome for almost a century, leaving an indelible mark on the empire's history, with episodes of greatness, but also of excess, family tragedies, and despotism. Tiberius Claudius Nero, known simply as Tiberius, was an experienced military commander responsible for important pacification campaigns in Germania and Pannonia. His ascent to imperial power was accompanied by tension and mistrust, especially from the Senate, which feared the strengthening of personal power initiated by Augustus. Of a somber and reserved temperament, Tiberius never sought popular love. preferring efficient administration and the maintenance of order over spectacular gestures. Under his rule, Rome maintained administrative stability and balanced public finances, but the political environment became increasingly oppressive. The fear of conspiracies led Tiberius to encourage the practice of delation, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and terror among Roman elites. This situation worsened with his voluntary withdrawal from public life to the island of Capri, where he spent the last years of his life, leaving the government in the hands of the feared and corrupt Praetorian prefect Sejanus, whose dramatic rise and fall marked one of the darkest chapters of Tiberius's reign. With Tiberius's death in 37 after Christ, the throne passed to Caligula, born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, grandson of Antonia Minor and great-grandson of Augustus. The nickname Caligula, a diminutive of Caliga, military boot, referred to the small boots he wore when accompanying his father Germanicus on military campaigns. Initially, his accession was greeted with enthusiasm. Young, charismatic, and heir to one of Rome's most venerated lineages, he seemed to embody the renewal expected after Tiberius's austere years. However, Caligula's reign quickly plunged into a chasm of eccentricity and tyranny. Various ancient accounts, whose veracity is now a subject of historiographical debate, describe him as a cruel, capricious, and mentally unstable ruler. Among the episodes attributed to him are the appointment of his horse Incitatus as senator, the ordering of statues of himself in temples, and the practice of summary executions for trivial reasons. His foreign policy was also marked by erratic decisions, such as the supposed campaign against Britain, that ended with the symbolic collection of seashells presented as spoils of the ocean. In 41 after Christ, after only 4 years of rule, Caligula was assassinated by members of his own Praetorian Guard, exasperated by his tyranny and fearful for their personal safety. The unexpected death of Caligula paved the way for the rise of his uncle, Claudius, a member until then marginalized within the imperial family due to physical and speech impediments that had excluded him from public functions. However, Claudius proved to be a capable, intelligent, and reformist ruler. Under his reign, 41-54 after Christ, the Roman Empire expanded significantly, notably with the conquest of Britain in 43 after Christ, incorporating the island into Rome's orbit after centuries of resistance. Claudius also promoted important administrative reforms. He expanded provincial participation in the Senate, modernized the bureaucratic apparatus, and improved Rome's urban and hydraulic infrastructure. His marital policy, however, exposed him to palace intrigues. He married his niece Agrippina Minor, who, according to ancient sources, poisoned Claudius to ensure the ascension of her son Nero to the throne. Thus Nero, born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, became emperor in 54 after Christ at the age of 16, under the tutelage of the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. The early years of his reign, marked by the influence of these advisors, were relatively balanced with moderate policies and a flourishing of culture. However, as he consolidated his power, Nero distanced himself from his former mentors and embarked on a path of autocracy, extravagance, and violence. Nero's figure is one of the most controversial and fascinating in Roman history. On one hand, he promoted grandiose spectacles such as artistic competitions, in which he himself performed as poet and musician. On the other, he ordered summary executions, including those of his mother, Agrippina, and his wife, Octavia. The episode that most marked his historical image was the Great Fire of Rome in 64 after Christ, which destroyed vast sectors of the city. Although ancient sources diverge on Nero's direct responsibility, many Romans believed that the emperor himself had ordered the fire to rebuild Rome according to his urbanistic and architectural plans, including the monumental Domus Aurea, a luxurious and extravagant palace in the city's heart. To divert accusations, Nero blamed the Christians, then a marginal sect, initiating the first major persecution of this group, with cruel executions that would forever mark the memory of nascent Christianity. In the final years of his reign, Nero faced a series of conspiracies, provincial revolts, and the progressive erosion of his legitimacy. In 68 after Christ, after being declared a public enemy by the Senate and abandoned by the Praetorian Guard, Nero fled Rome and, surrounded by the Senate's envoys, committed suicide, supposedly uttering the words, "Qualis artifex pereo," What an artist dies with me. With his death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty came to an end, and Rome plunged into a period of chaos and instability, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, during which generals violently vied for power. The dynasty that began with the prudence of Augustus ended with the artistic and political delirium of Nero, tragically illustrating the course of the complex dynamics of power, family, and authority within the Roman Empire. With Nero's suicide in 68 after Christ, not only did the Julio-Claudian dynasty come to an end, but also the fragile illusion of dynastic stability that Augustus had sought to bequeath to posterity. The Roman Empire, bereft of a legitimate heir, plunged into one of the most intense and chaotic succession crises in its history, the Year of the Four Emperors. This period, which extended from June 68 to December 69 after Christ, was marked by rapid changes in imperial power, violent military confrontations, and a profound questioning of the nature of authority and legitimacy in Rome. The first to ascend was Galba, governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, who, encouraged by allies in the Senate and the initial support of the Praetorian Guard, marched on Rome and assumed the imperial title. However, Galba was a man of austere habits and inflexible demeanor, traits that quickly alienated both the troops and the people. His refusal to reward the soldiers who had contributed to his rise to the throne, and his choice of Lucius Calpurnius Piso as heir, bypassing other influential candidates, fueled conspiracies around him. Dissatisfaction found an echo in Otho, a former ally of Galba and one of those who felt bypassed in the line of succession. With the support of the Praetorian Guard, Otho staged a coup in January 69 after Christ, during which Galba and Piso were assassinated in the Roman Forum. Assuming power, Otho sought to legitimize his rule and pacify the empire, but soon found himself threatened by another claimant, Vitellius, commander of the legions of the Rhine, proclaimed emperor by his soldiers in a military acclamation that revealed the growing autonomy and power of the forces stationed in the provinces. Vitellius advanced from Germania towards Italy, defeating Otho at the Battle of Bedriacum. Faced with defeat, Otho committed suicide, an act that, according to chronicles, was received with sorrow and admiration, seen as a sacrifice to spare Rome further bloodshed. Vitellius then assumed the throne, but his government quickly deteriorated amid chaotic administration, marked by excessive luxury, favoritism toward incompetent allies, and increasing political violence. Meanwhile, in the east, the legions of Judea, Egypt, and Syria, under the command of Titus Flavius Vespasianus, acclaimed him emperor. Vespasian, a veteran of military campaigns in Britannia, and at that moment leading the suppression of the Great Jewish Revolt, initially hesitated, but, convinced that his cause was just, and backed by the support of various eastern provinces, organized an offensive to depose Vitellius. The forces loyal to Vespasian, commanded by Marcus Antonius Primus, defeated Vitellius's troops at the Second Battle of Bedriacum, and advanced on Rome, where a violent urban confrontation took place. Vitellius was captured and executed in December 69 after Christ, his corpse dragged through the city streets, a spectacle of barbarity that symbolized the collapse of traditional order. With Vespasian's victory, the Flavian dynasty began, marking the consolidation of power and the restoration of imperial stability after the period of anarchy. Vespasian, although not belonging to Rome's traditional nobility, but instead to an equestrian family from Riati in Etruria, represented a new conception of power, less based on aristocratic lineage and more founded on military competence, the support of the legions, and administrative efficiency. Assuming the throne in 70 after Christ, Vespasian initiated a policy of reconstruction and reorganization of the empire. He restored military discipline, suppressed provincial revolts, and launched vast public works programs, including the construction of the Flavian Amphitheater, later known as the Colosseum, the ultimate symbol of imperial monumentality and the new regime's generosity toward the Roman people. Vespasian's reign was also marked by the conclusion of the war in Judea, led by his son, Titus, with the capture of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 after Christ, an event with profound religious and cultural repercussions perpetuated in the Arch of Titus in Rome. Thus the Year of the Four Emperors, not only revealed the fragility of Rome's political institutions in the face of military ambitions, but also precipitated a significant shift in the profile of imperial power, from the traditional republican aristocracy to a more pragmatic elite, tied to effective administration and the loyalty of the legions. The Flavian consolidation ensured, at least temporarily, the restoration of imperial order and prestige, demonstrating that Rome, even shaken by internal crises and anarchy, possessed a remarkable capacity for regeneration and continuity. After the turbulence of the Year of the Four Emperors and the Flavian consolidation, the Roman Empire entered one of its most prosperous and stable periods, known in modern historiography as the Era of the Good Emperors. This expression, coined by the historian Edward Gibbon, refers to the period from 96 to 180 after Christ, during which Rome was governed by a succession of emperors who, although not directly linked by blood ties, stood out for their administrative competence, political moderation, and commitment to the welfare of the empire. This virtuous cycle began with the rise of Hampundi Nerva in 96 after Christ, following the assassination of Domitian, the last Flavian emperor. Nerva, a respected senator with a conciliatory profile, was chosen by the Senate in an attempt to restore harmony between imperial power and the senatorial aristocracy, which had been shaken by Domitian's repression. Despite his brief reign, Nerva made one of the most important decisions in imperial history, the adoption of Trajan, a competent and popular general, as his successor, inaugurating the practice of free meritocratic adoption as the criterion of succession instead of direct hereditary ties. Trajan, of Hispanic origin, became emperor in 98 after Christ and led the Roman Empire to its greatest territorial extent. The most famous campaigns of his reign were the Dacian Wars Gaeti, fought against King Decebalus. The Roman victory in these campaigns not only secured control over the rich region of Dacia, present-day Romania, but also provided a vast influx of resources that financed monumental public works in Rome, such as the Column of Trajan, an enduring symbol of his victories, and the imposing Forum of Trajan. In addition to territorial conquests, Trajan distinguished himself through his generous and effective domestic policy. He expanded public roads, encouraged the construction of aqueducts, bridges, and ports, and created social assistance institutions such as the alimenta, food aid programs for poor children, reflecting his concern for the well-being of citizens. His fame transcended the centuries, to the point that in medieval Christian tradition, he was considered the only pagan emperor admitted to paradise. Upon his death in 117 after Christ, Trajan was succeeded by his nephew and adopted son, Hadrian, whose vision of government contrasted sharply with that of his predecessor. If Trajan was the conqueror par excellence, Hadrian was the consolidator of borders and the humanist. Recognizing the logistical and administrative limits of the empire, Hadrian abandoned some of Trajan's eastern conquests and focused on fortifying the frontiers, with Hadrian's Wall, erected in northern Britannia, being the most famous example of this defensive policy. Hadrian was also a great patron of the arts and architecture, promoting the construction of masterpieces such as the Pantheon, with its monumental dome, and his villa in Tivoli, a vast complex reflecting his admiration for Hellenic culture. Deeply erudite, Hadrian traveled extensively through the provinces, personally supervising administration and the troops, seeking to strengthen the unity of the empire. After Hadrian, power passed to Antoninus Pius, another adoptive emperor, whose reign between 138 and 161 after Christ was marked by unprecedented stability. Under Antoninus, the empire experienced a period of peace, economic prosperity, and cultural flourishing. His administration was guided by respect for legal institutions and the promotion of justice. So tranquil was his reign that he never needed to leave Italy to conduct military campaigns, entrusting the defense of the frontiers to his generals. The succession of Antoninus Pius brought to the throne Marcus Aurelius, perhaps the most emblematic of the good emperors, not only for his administrative and military competence, but also for his philosophical and reflective personality. A follower of Chidi Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius bequeathed to posterity his work, Meditations, one of the most important expressions of practical philosophy in antiquity. However, unlike his predecessors, Marcus Aurelius faced serious military challenges, especially the Marcomannic Wars, triggered by Germanic tribes pressing the Danube frontiers. Although he achieved important victories, the constant need for military mobilization strained imperial finances and revealed the structural weaknesses of the empire. Internally, the greatest tragedy of his reign was the devastating Antonine Plague, probably a form of smallpox or measles, which decimated millions of inhabitants, weakening the economy and the armies. Still, Marcus Aurelius remained faithful to his duties as emperor and philosopher, balancing military action with the promotion of justice and the public good. The era of the good emperors ended with his death in 180 after Christ and the accession of his son, Byzantine Empire, whose personality and style of governance starkly contrasted with the ideals of his predecessors. The choice of a biological heir instead of a meritocratic and adoptive successor inaugurated a new cycle of instability and decline. This extraordinary period, marked by the virtue of its rulers, cultural flourishing, and economic expansion, would be remembered as the apogee of the Roman Empire, when Rome reached the height of its territorial extent, administrative efficiency, and social cohesion. A time when emperors were not only absolute rulers, but above all public servants and examples of moderation, establishing an ideal of governance that would continue to inspire future generations, even after the fall of the empire. While Rome enjoyed its apogee under the so-called good emperors, silently within the vast empire, a cultural and spiritual force was germinating that, within a few centuries, would not only profoundly transform Rome's political and social structures, but also redefine the very course of Western civilization, Christianity. The emergence of this new religion, initially an obscure Jewish sect in the province of Judea, quickly became a far-reaching social phenomenon, challenging Roman religious traditions, questioning consecrated ethical values, and above all, offering a new vision of human destiny and imperial power. Christianity was born in a context of intense religious and political tensions. The province of Judea, incorporated into Roman rule since the 1st century before Christ, was a territory teeming with messianism, national resistance, and internal conflicts. It was in this environment that Jesus of Nazareth, a historical figure and founder of the Christian faith, began his preaching, proclaiming the imminence of the kingdom of God, the need for repentance, and an ethic radically centered on love for one's neighbor, mercy, and the spiritual equality of all human beings. To Roman authorities, Jesus was not initially a threat. His execution around the year 30 after Christ, under the authority of Governor Pontius Pilate, was just another episode in the long history of local repression against agitators and prophets. However, Christianity did not cease with his death. On the contrary, reports of his resurrection and the tireless preaching of his followers, such as the apostles Peter and Paul, quickly spread the new faith through the cities of the empire, taking advantage of Rome's extraordinary network of communications. Paved roads, maritime routes, military colonies, and the common language, Koine Greek, which facilitated understanding among diverse peoples. What distinguished Christianity from the traditional religions of the Roman Empire was not only its doctrine, but also its organizational structure and universal pretension. While Roman religions were markedly civic and local, integrated into the public cult of the state and associated with family rites, Christianity presented itself as a supranational and transcendent faith, independent of political and social boundaries, accessible to all, women and men, rich and poor, free and enslaved. This universality, combined with its refusal to participate in civic cults and above all the imperial cult, a political religious ceremony that deified the emperor and symbolically unified the empire, quickly placed Christians on a collision course with Roman authorities. Although early persecutions were episodic and local, such as the one promoted by Nero after the fire of Rome in 64 after Christ, throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, imperial authorities increasingly viewed Christianity as a growing threat to the political and cultural cohesion of the empire. The persecutions intensified under emperors such as Decius, who in 249 after Christ ordered all inhabitants of the empire to perform sacrifices to the traditional gods, and later under Diocletian, who at the beginning of the 4th century promoted the so-called Great Persecution, the most systematic and violent up to that point. However, far from suffocating the new faith, the persecutions strengthened it, producing a legion of martyrs whose memory inspired devotion, courage, and communal identity among the faithful. Parallel to the growth of Christianity, other cultural transformations were reshaping the empire. The expansion of Roman law with the progressive granting of citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, under the Edict of Caracalla in 212 after Christ, promoted an unprecedented legal homogenization, although social and cultural inequalities remained. Greek consolidated itself as the lingua franca in the East, while Latin became the administrative and legal language in the West, promoting a linguistic unity that would endure long beyond the fall of the empire. Culturally, the Roman world experienced, especially between the 2nd and 3rd centuries, an intense spiritual effervescence marked by religious syncretism. Eastern cults, such as those of Mithras, Isis, and Cybele, as well as philosophies like Neoplatonism, flourished and competed for the allegiance of Roman citizens, offering responses to the metaphysical anxieties of a population increasingly restless in the face of the political and economic crisis that was beginning to erode the empire's foundations. But it was Christianity that gradually established itself as the dominant spiritual force. Its definitive victory began with the conversion of Emperor Constantine and the promulgation of the Ius Edict of Milan in 313 after Christ, which granted religious freedom to Christians, ending persecutions and paving the way for their progressive integration into the state apparatus. In less than a century under Theodosius I, Christianity would become the official religion of the empire, while pagan cults were progressively prohibited. This transformation not only changed the religious face of Rome, but also reconfigured its culture, law, and politics. The Roman Empire that emerged from Constantine's conversion was no longer merely a military and administrative machine. It was increasingly becoming a spiritual empire, whose center ceased to be the veneration of the traditional pantheon gods and shifted to the cross, symbol of redemption and the promise of eternal life. Thus, Christianity was not merely a religious phenomenon internal to Rome's history. It was perhaps the most profound and enduring cultural transformation of antiquity, whose effects would echo far beyond the fall of the empire, structuring the spiritual, moral, and legal foundations of the Western civilization that inherited from it not only the legacy of legions and laws, but also the memory of the martyrs and the Christian hope. As the Roman Empire advanced through the 4th and 5th centuries after Christ, the challenges it faced became increasingly complex and insurmountable for a structure of power conceived in unity and centralization. The vast territorial expanse, which had once been a source of glory and wealth, turned into a logistical and military burden of colossal proportions. Borders exposed to barbarian invasions, recurring economic crises, internal disputes for the throne, and religious and cultural pressures converged into one of the most decisive transformations in Roman history, the division of the empire between East and West, a split that not only reorganized political power, but would shape the map of Europe and the Mediterranean for millennia to come. The first major move toward the formal division of the empire occurred with the rise of Diocletian to power in 284 after Christ, intending to contain the chaos that had plagued Rome since the so-called crisis of the 3rd century, a period marked by successive usurpations, economic collapses, and invasions. Diocletian implemented one of the most radical administrative reforms in imperial history, the tetrarchy. This system established the governance of the empire by 4 simultaneous emperors, 2 Augusti, who governed the eastern and western halves, and 2 Caesars, designated as successors and direct aides. The goal was to decentralize power, making it more agile and efficient, while at the same time ensuring a peaceful and predictable succession. The administrative seat of the empire effectively shifted to various strategic cities near the frontiers: Nicomedia, Sirmium, Trier, and Milan, while Rome, the ancient capital, remained as a symbolic and traditional center. Although the tetrarchy temporarily restored stability and strengthened frontier defenses, it also exposed the impossibility of maintaining political and administrative unity in such a vast empire. Rivalries among the tetrarchs and personal ambitions soon undermined the system, resulting in new civil wars. It was in this context that Constantine distinguished himself. Initially proclaimed emperor by the troops in Britannia in 306 after Christ, and who, after years of conflict, managed to reunify the empire under his authority. His victory over Maxentius at the famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312, after Christ not only secured his dominance over the West, but also was marked by the legendary episode in which Constantine reportedly had a vision of the Christian symbol, the Chiros, accompanied by the phrase "in hoc signo vinces," "in this sign you will conquer." Constantine's conversion to Christianity and the promulgation of the Edict of Milan in 313 after Christ marked a turning point in the relationship between the Roman state and religion, culminating a few decades later in the official Christianization of the empire. However, perhaps even more decisive was the founding in 330 after Christ of a new imperial capital, Constantinople, built upon the ancient Greek city of Byzantium on the Bosporus between Europe and Asia. Constantinople was not conceived merely as an alternative administrative center, but as the new Rome, a monumental city richly adorned with palaces, churches, and hippodromes, and protected by formidable walls. Its strategic location controlled the trade and military routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, ensuring more direct command over the wealthier and more urbanized eastern provinces. The founding of Constantinople symbolized the definitive emergence of the East as the new gravitational center of the empire. At the same time, the West, with Rome and its provinces, began to experience a gradual decline, exacerbated by the pressure of barbarian migrations and invasions, demographic crisis, and economic fragmentation. In 395 after Christ, after the death of Emperor Theodosius I, the last to effectively rule the unified empire, the division became definitive. His two sons, Arcadius and Honorius, respectively assumed the eastern throne with its seat in Constantinople, and the western throne with the capital in Ravenna. The Regio Western Roman Empire, increasingly vulnerable, faced growing difficulties in maintaining the integrity of its borders, especially in Germania and Gaul, where barbarian peoples such as the Visigoths, Vandals, and Suebi incessantly pressed. The East, in turn, though also threatened, benefited from a more robust administrative infrastructure, a more dynamic economy, and a consolidated urban tradition. The division of the empire did not initially mean a cultural or political rupture, but rather a pragmatic adaptation to new realities of power. Laws continued to be promulgated under the joint authority of the two emperors, and the idea of a universal empire, heir to Rome, persisted as a political and spiritual ideal. However, over the centuries, the split deepened, generating distinct political, religious, and cultural traditions. While the West marched towards collapse, consummated with the deposition of the Romulus Augustulus in 476 after Christ, the East progressively transformed into what modern historians call the Byzantine Empire, a political entity that, though self-identified as Roman, Romaioi, developed its own characteristics, amalgamating Hellenistic, Eastern, and Christian heritages, and would survive for almost 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, until 1453, with the capture of Constantinople by the Ottomans. Thus, the division of the empire was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual process of reconfiguration of the Roman world, which responded with pragmatism and creativity to the challenges imposed by geography, economy, and the changing cultural and spiritual forces. Rome and Constantinople became, from then on, not just two cities but two symbols. On one side, the memory of a republic and an empire that had conquered the world. On the other, the promise of a new order, Christian and imperial, that would perpetuate the name of Rome for many centuries beyond its own political fall. The process that led to the fall of the Western Roman Empire was long, complex, and multifaceted, unfolding over several centuries and involving internal and external factors that, combined, gradually eroded the political, economic, and military foundations that had sustained Rome as the hegemonic power of the Mediterranean world. Central to this process was the phenomenon known as the Barbarian invasions, a movement of migrations and military incursions by various Germanic, Slavic, Iranian, and Hunnic peoples who, pressured by climatic changes, demographic pressures, and the expansion of rival empires, moved toward the empire's borders, seeking space, security, and, in many cases, sharing in the very Roman ideal of civilization and power. The term barbarians used by the Romans to designate the peoples living beyond their borders, especially to the north of the Danube and the Rhine, expressed an ethnocentric view that associated civilization with Romanity. However, many of these peoples had organized political structures, sophisticated warrior traditions, and had maintained commercial, military, and cultural relations with Rome for centuries, with frequent episodes of barbarians enlisting in the legions, dynastic alliances, and even the granting of Roman citizenship. The beginning of large-scale migratory pressure can be situated at the end of the 4th century after Christ, with the arrival of the Inzao, a people of Asian origin who, with their military tactics based on light cavalry and the composite bow, imposed severe pressure on the Germanic peoples situated to the west, forcing them to seek refuge within Roman borders. The most emblematic episode of this movement was the entry of the Visigoth into the empire in 376 after Christ, crossing the Danube with imperial authorization, but soon revolting due to the exploitation and mistreatment they suffered from local authorities. The Visigothic rebellion culminated in the catastrophic Battle of Adrianople in 378 after Christ, in which Emperor Valens was killed in combat and 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army were annihilated. This disaster revealed not only the military vulnerability of the empire, but also the failure of its border policy, based on defensive containment and the controlled absorption of barbarian peoples. In the following years, the Visigoths, under the leadership of Alaric, traversed the Balkan Peninsula and later invaded Italy. The culminating episode of this trajectory was the sack of Rome in 410 after Christ, when, for the first time in nearly 800 years, the Eternal City was taken by a foreign army. Although the sack was relatively moderate in terms of physical destruction, its symbolic impact was devastating, fueling a widespread sense that imperial Rome was irreversibly in decline. Simultaneously, other barbarian populations took advantage of the fragility of Roman frontiers to settle in the empire's provinces. In 406 after Christ, a conglomerate of peoples, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, crossed the frozen Rhine and penetrated Gaul, triggering a wave of territorial occupations that would quickly extend to Hispania and later to North Africa. Among these groups, the Can Vandals, under the leadership of Hargenseric, stood out for their audacity. In 439 after Christ, they captured Carthage, one of the empire's main cities and a vital grain supply center for Rome. From their base in North Africa, the Vandals transformed into a naval power, conducting raiding expeditions throughout the western Mediterranean, including a new sack of Rome in 455 after Christ, significantly more destructive than that perpetrated by the Visigoths. Amid this scenario of territorial fragmentation and increasing autonomy of provincial armies, central Roman power progressively weakened. The figure of the emperor, once the embodiment of power and imperial unity, became an increasingly symbolic position, manipulated by barbarian generals who held the actual military power, such as the Vandal Stilicha or the Suebian Ricimer. Meanwhile, the Western Empire faced a deep economic crisis. The collapse of trade networks, the ruralization of the economy, the depreciation of currency, and the decline in tax collection undermined the state's ability to maintain its armies, public works, and administrative services. The final blow occurred in 476 after Christ, when Odoacer, leader of a barbarian contingent federated with the empire, deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a youth of only 16 years. Odoacer, instead of assuming the imperial title, sent the imperial insignia to the Eastern emperor, Zeno, thus symbolizing the end of the Western Roman Empire as an autonomous political entity. However, it is important to highlight that the so-called fall of Rome was not a sudden or absolute collapse, but rather a gradual process of transformation. Many Roman institutions, such as law, administration, and even Christianity, continued to exert influence in the barbarian kingdoms that established themselves in the former imperial provinces, such as the Visigoths in Hispania, the Ostrogoths in Italy, and the Franks in Gaul. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, continued for another 1,000 years, preserving and transforming Roman heritage under the form of the Byzantine Empire, which would endure until the capture of its capital by the Ottomans in 1453. Thus, the fall of Rome did not represent the end of a civilization, but the transition from an ancient imperial model to new forms of power, culture, and identity that would profoundly shape the Middle Ages and the very configuration of the European world. Rome, even fallen, remained alive, not only in its monumental ruins or its inherited institutions, but in the very cultural memory of the West as an eternal symbol of glory, power, and civilization. Although the Western Roman Empire disappeared as a political entity in 476 after Christ, its influence on human history never extinguished. On the contrary, Rome survived in multiple dimensions, in its monumental architecture that still frames cities and landscapes today, in its law, which provided the normative basis for countless modern legal systems, and in its languages, which evolved to form the core of the Latin cultures that spread across the planet. The heritage of Rome is thus a constant and indelible presence, as alive as the cities it once ruled, and as penetrating as the ideas it codified. In the legal field, Roman contribution is monumental and possibly the most enduring. From the laws of the 12 Tables, drafted in the 5th century before Christ, to the monumental Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian. In the 6th century after Christ, Rome developed a legal system based on the rationalization of norms, the codification of procedures, and the conception of universal rights and duties. Roman law not only regulated relations between citizens and the state, but also offered sophisticated legal solutions for contracts, property, inheritance, and family, establishing foundations that would later be adopted, adapted, and expanded in the legal traditions of continental Europe. The impact of this legacy can be seen, for example, in the famed Napoleonic Code rise of the early 19th century, whose structure was strongly inspired by the Roman model, and more broadly, in the affray civil law systems that currently predominate in countries of Latin America, continental Europe, Africa, and parts of Asia. More than a set of rules, Roman law introduced a conception of justice founded on reason, equity, and the idea that the law should be applied universally, principles that shape Western legal philosophy to this day. In architecture, Rome left equally deep and visible marks. Roman engineering took the ability to build on a large scale and with durability to new heights. Mastery of the yarchow, the avoltoir, and the dome allowed the Romans to create grand and functional structures such as aqueducts, which transported water for dozens of kilometers, paved roads that connected the ends of the empire, amphitheaters, like the monumental Colosseum, baths, which served as centers of leisure and hygiene, and had temples that celebrated the gods and reinforced the authority of the state. Roman urban design with its central forum, grid streets, sewage systems, and water supply infrastructure established a model of urbanism that would deeply influence medieval and modern cities. The ruins of Pompeii, Herculaneum, Ephesus, and Leptis Magna, among many others, attest to the technical and aesthetic sophistication of Roman architecture, which, even reduced to vestiges, continues to inspire architects, engineers, and artists around the world. Beyond engineering works, Rome also developed an architectural style that combined functionality and magnificence, visible in monuments such as the Mythical Pantheon of Rome, whose hemispherical dome, still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, remains a testament to Roman technical genius. This tradition was revived and reinterpreted by movements such as the Renaissance, which recovered Roman ideals of proportion, symmetry, and monumentality, and later by neoclassicism, whose civic and institutional buildings, scattered across European and American capitals, deliberately evoke Rome's imperial aesthetic. In the linguistic domain, Rome's legacy is equally vast and profound. Latin rhetoric, the official language of the empire, spread throughout Roman territory, imposing itself as the administrative, legal, and literary language. Even after the fall of the empire, Latin remained the lingua franca of European culture, being the language of the Catholic Church, science, law, and philosophy throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. More importantly, the vulgar Latin spoken daily by populations of the empire's western provinces gradually evolved into the so-called Romance languages, which today total hundreds of millions of speakers: Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, Romanian, along with various regional variants and dialects. The grammatical structure, basic vocabulary, and idiomatic expressions of these languages directly preserve the Latin heritage, constituting one of the most impressive cultural continuities in human history. But Rome's linguistic legacy is not limited to the Romance languages. Latin also permeated the English language, especially after the Norman conquest of England, contributing thousands of words and expressions, particularly in the fields of law, medicine, science, and philosophy. Thus, even peoples who never formed part of the Roman Empire, such as the Anglo-Saxons, became linguistically and culturally integrated into the Roman universe through language. This cultural legacy also extends to political institutions, religion, and worldview. The idea of a universal state, endowed with laws and citizenship, the conception of the cities as a political and cultural center, the notion of imperium as sovereign power, and even the tradition of the separation between temporal power and spiritual power, later consolidated in Christendom, are all Roman legacies that decisively shaped Western civilization. Thus, Rome did not die with the deposition of Romulus or Augustulus, nor is it restricted to the ruins scattered across European and Mediterranean landscapes. Rome lives in the words we speak, the laws we obey, the cities we inhabit, and the institutions that govern us. Its legacy is, paradoxically, more enduring than any empire of steel or stone. It survives as a civilization incorporated into the very fabric of modernity, a perennial testament to humanity's capacity to build, organize, and transmit culture through time and space. Although the political power of Rome declined with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 after Christ, the image and memory of the city and its civilization have never ceased to exert a profound and continuous influence on the collective imagination of humanity. Rome transformed into a symbol, an idea, an inescapable reference for successive generations of thinkers, artists, architects, jurists, and politicians who, over the centuries, sought in it inspiration, legitimacy, or a model to be followed, or in some cases to be surpassed. During the calm Middle Ages, Rome maintained its importance as the spiritual center of the Christian West. The city, seat of the papacy, became the capital of Latin Christendom, preserving through the Catholic Church the continuity of many Roman traditions, especially in law, administration, and ceremonial. Latin remained the language of liturgy and scholarship, and the ancient ruins were integrated into the urban landscape and memory, often converted into churches, monasteries, and fortresses. However, it was with the Renaissance from the 14th century onwards that Rome experienced a true rediscovery and revaluation of its classical past. Artists and intellectuals of the humanist movement, such as Petrarch, Poggio Bracciolini, and Leon Battista Alberti, rediscovered ancient texts, copied forgotten manuscripts, and laid the foundations of a new aesthetic that sought to revive the purity, harmony, and grandeur of classical culture. Roman antiquity came to be conceived not as a dead relic, but as a living model of excellence to be imitated and surpassed. Rome, in this period, became a vast construction site. The popes, especially during the 15th and 16th centuries, led an ambitious project of reconstruction and monumentalization of the city, sponsoring artists such as Michelangelo, Raphael, and Bernini. Works such as St. Peter's Basilica, the remodeling of the Piazza del Campidoglio, and numerous fountains and Baroque palaces once again transformed Rome into one of the artistic capitals of the world, where the classical legacy was reinterpreted in light of the values and needs of modernity. Simultaneously, Rome established itself as a central object of historical and political reflection. The historian and philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli, in his work Discourses on Livy, analyzed the Roman Republican experience as a model for thinking about civic virtues and the political organization of his own time. The Roman example became a reference for debates on liberty, citizenship, and power, profoundly influencing the processes of formation of modern states. In the 18th century, Neoclassicism revitalized the fascination with ancient Rome. The systematic rediscovery of archaeological sites, such as Pompeii and Herculaneum, fueled academic and artistic interest, inspiring architects, sculptors, and painters to revive classical canons of proportion and sobriety. Rome became an obligatory destination of this grand tour, the educational journey undertaken by young European aristocrats seeking immersion in classical culture, consolidating its image as the eternal city, where past and present coexist in a unique symbiosis. Throughout the mid-11th century, Rome was the stage for intense political and cultural processes, especially during the movement for Italian unification, the Risorgimento. In 1870, Rome was incorporated into the newly unified Kingdom of Italy, becoming its capital and reaffirming its status as a political center. This new phase promoted urban renewal that sought to modernize the city without breaking with its monumental heritage, creating wide avenues, squares, and public buildings that dialogued with the imperial legacy. In the 20th century, Rome was once again instrumentalized as a political symbol, particularly under the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini, who intensely exploited the Roman heritage to legitimize his vision of a new Italian empire. Ancient monuments were restored, large avenues were opened, such as the Via dei Fori Imperiali, and public events were organized with aesthetics and rhetoric inspired by classical Rome in a deliberate effort to connect the imperial past with the contemporary political project. At the same time, the city continued to be one of the most important centers of cultural and cinematic production, especially with the emergence of Cinecittà, the major film studio that hosted emblematic productions of Italian neo-realism, and later grand historical films such as Cat Ben-Hur and Count Gladiator, which in different ways continued to reenact and reinterpret the history of Rome for global audiences. In contemporary times, Rome remains a universal icon of culture and history. Its ruins, the Roman Forum, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, are visited by millions of tourists every year, while its urban landscape, steeped in history, continues to inspire artists, writers, and filmmakers. The city is also home to international institutions such as the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, reinforcing its role as a global political and cultural center. More than a mere archaeological site or an open-air museum, Rome is a living palimpsest, where successive layers of history, culture, and identity overlap and incessantly dialogue. From the Rome of kings to that of emperors, from the city of popes to the center of the modern Italian state, passing through Renaissance, Baroque, neoclassical, and contemporary Rome, the Eternal City remains a sublime testimony to humanity's capacity to build, remember, and transform. Rome is ultimately more than a place. It is an idea that survives and inspires, that challenges and enchants, that educates and fascinates. As Lord Byron Chasinders wrote, "While Rome exists, civilization will not end." Rome, the city that once ruled the world, persists today as one of the most impressive testimonies to historical continuity and cultural permanence. Walking through its cobblestone streets, lined with broken columns, triumphal arches, and millennia-old churches, visitors are constantly reminded that Rome is simultaneously a vibrant 21st century metropolis and a city museum, where the ruins of the past viscerally coexist with the intense pulse of modern life. At the heart of the city, the Roman Forum, once the political, religious, and legal center of the empire, remains one of the most impressive archaeological sites in the world, with the columns of the temples of Saturn and Vesta still defying time. Next to it rises the Colosseum, the largest amphitheater ever built, a universal symbol of Roman ingenuity and the ambivalence of its culture, which combined spectacle and violence, civilization and brutality. Contemporary Rome is also defined by its unique layering of epochs. Over the ruins of Republican and Imperial Rome stand Paleo-Christian churches, medieval basilicas, Renaissance palaces, and Baroque squares, composing an urban setting where every corner is a lesson in history. The Pantheon, a remarkable example of preserved Roman architecture, transformed into a Christian church in the 7th century, remains in active use today, with its monumental dome and open oculus, a perfect metaphor for the connection between the earthly and the eternal that Rome represents. But Rome is more than an archaeological repository. It is also a space of daily life, a political, economic, and spiritual center. As the capital of the Italian Republic, it houses the main government bodies such as the Palazzo Quirinale, the official residence of the President of the Republic, and the Palazzo Montecitorio, seat of the Chamber of Deputies. It is also the heart of the Catholic Church, with the Vatican I, an independent state within the city, concentrating the central government of the Church, the papacy, and some of humanity's greatest artistic treasures, such as the Sistine Chapel, with Michelangelo's frescoes, and the Vatican museums, which house collections of inestimable value. Tourism is now one of Rome's main economic activities, attracting millions of visitors every year, who are enchanted by its history, art, and unique atmosphere. Restaurants, trattorias, and cafes coexist with millennia-old ruins, while international designer stores line historic streets such as Via del Corso and Via dei Condotti, demonstrating Rome's capacity to integrate tradition and modernity, consumption and contemplation. Moreover, Rome is an academic and cultural center of international prominence, with universities such as O Sapienza, one of the oldest and most prestigious in Europe, and research centers that attract scholars of archaeology, history, law, and the arts from around the world. The city also hosts renowned cultural events, such as the Rome Film Festival, and opera seasons at the Teatro dell'Opera di Roma. Living with the past imposes challenges on the contemporary city. The need to preserve its archaeological and monumental heritage faces the pressures of urbanization, mass tourism, and climate change. Conservation and restoration programs, such as those carried out at the Colosseum and the Forum, are constant, mobilizing public and private resources and involving the collaboration of international specialists. However, beyond public policies or institutional initiatives, it is the very Roman spirit, forged over millennia of adaptation and resilience, that ensures the city's continuity. Rome has survived the fall of the empire, barbarian invasions, medieval political fragmentation, plagues, wars, and the transformations of the modern world, always preserving its essence as the eternal city. In Rome, past and present do not oppose each other. They coexist and mutually enrich one another. The city is at once a place where one witnesses the material vestiges of one of history's greatest civilizations, and a space where life continues, vibrant and irreverent, as it always has been. Thus, Rome remains a symbol not only of what it was, but also of what it continues to be. A center where time bends, where stones tell stories, where every square and every monument reminds the world of the grandeur and fragility of the human adventure. Between ruins and eternity, Rome is and always will be a cultural beacon, a mirror of civilization, and a perpetual invitation to contemplation and wonder. Throughout this journey, we crossed the mythical hills where, according to legend, Romulus traced the sacred boundaries of the city that would become mistress of the world. We witnessed the turbulent transition from monarchy to republic, the rise of the legions, the victories and sacrifices that led Rome to dominate continents, seas, and diverse cultures. We observed the reforms, the crises, and the internal conflicts that shook but never destroyed the indomitable spirit of this civilization. We saw how the Republic, corroded by personal ambitions and social tensions, gave way to the empire under the leadership of figures as emblematic as they were controversial. Caesar, Augustus, Nero, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius. We contemplated the apogee, when Rome ruled wisely, administered efficiently and inspired with its refined culture, and also the decline, when the cold winds of barbarian invasions and the weight of its own internal contradictions sealed the political end of Western Rome. But Rome did not die. It survived, powerful and present, in the language we speak, in the laws we follow, in the cities we build, in the philosophy we profess, and even in the symbols and rites of political and religious power. It survived in the marble that still rises against the sky, in the arches that eternalize forgotten victories, in the millennia-old roads that silently continue to shape the contours of Europe. It survived in the ideas of empire, citizenship, virtue, and law, transmitted from generation to generation, reinvented in every era. Rome is not merely a collection of ruins, nor a chapter closed in history books. It is, above all, an archetype, an ideal that permeates Western culture as an essential substratum, and that, even after 2 millennia, continues to question us about power and its legitimacy, about glory and its price, about rise and fall, about the human capacity to create, dominate, and, above all, endure. In the sight of the stones that still stand in the Forum, in the shadow cast by the Pantheon's dome, in the golden reflection of the waters flowing beneath the bridges of the Tiber, Rome reminds us incessantly that time passes, but ideas and legacies can be eternal. Thus we conclude this journey not with a farewell, but with the certainty that Rome, the eternal city, transcends time and the empires it founded. Rome is not merely a place. It is a lesson, a mirror, a promise that humanity can, when it wills, erect something that defies its own finitude. Eternal Rome, immortal Rome.